Welcome back, art history students. Today, we are continuing our journey into the final unit that you need to know before the art history exam, which is America and Europe from 1750 to 1980. Now, we've looked at two other periods in this unit. We looked at Rococo, which is really the art of the aristocracy in France prior to the French Revolution, that whole idea of selfishness, these nobles essentially only self-absorbed in their own lives and not really caring about how the 99% of the population was being treated in France that will eventually lead to the revolution. We also looked at Neoclassicism, which is this desire to give yourself and sacrifice yourself for the good of the country or the good of your people, which is very much connected to the ideas of the French Revolution. It also is very much related to the ideals of classic art and architecture of Greece and Rome. And now we're moving on to another era in art history that is in existence from around 1815 to 1850. It comes right after Neoclassicism, that kind of overlap a little bit, known as Romanticism. So please, again, hit pause, go read the note packet that I have attached to this post, and make sure that you have some background information before we get into the pieces that you need to know. Now, the name Romanticism really is kind of coming from this longing for this medieval past. So, Europe had been going through a pretty tumultuous time with the rise of Napoleon, the French Revolution. Napoleon conquers a lot of Europe at this point in time, so a lot of Europe is at war. And what you have is these artists and many people and philosophers and writers of the time in the early 1800s longing for this idea of chivalry that is kind of romanticized about the medieval period. So just like the neoclassic era was inspired by the rationality of Greece and Rome, Romanticism is a reaction to neoclassicism. So neoclassicism was very rational, very calm, very cool, very collected. Now, in Romanticism, you're going to see kind of nature and this longing for nature prior to the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution, in many artists' eyes and writers' eyes, is destroying the beautiful natural landscape. And you're also going to see not just nature, but sometimes the use of emotion and other exotic qualities that aren't found in people's everyday lives. There's an emphasis, again, on emotion over reason, and this interest in these exotic places that we haven't seen before. And again, just to kind of go back to the root of what the word Romanticism means, it's that, that revived interest in the medieval tales of chivalry and the adventures called romances that were written during the Middle Ages. And you're going to see that inspire the paintings and the art, and you're also going to see that inspire the architecture, especially when we get to the Parliament building. It looks very Gothic, and if you remember, Gothic was part of the Middle Ages. Okay, so what do you guys have to write down? So the first thing you want to write down in your notes today is this little blurb about what the Romantic period is. So, again, it is inspired by the French Revolution. It's a reaction to the French Revolution and other European revolts of the 1800s. It's not just going to be France that there will be a revolt in. There's going to be Greece will be rising up and fighting for its independence from the Ottoman Turks. You're going to see industrialization, the use of machinery destroying and damaging the natural landscape. You're going to see urbanization, so cities be getting bigger and bigger. The idea of nationalism that will come from the Greek War from independence. That will all inspire what will happen and the art that will be created in the Romantic period. So both Neoclassicism and Romanticism are reactions to earlier or ongoing art movements. So Neoclassicism was a reaction against the overtly ornate and frivolous Rococo art, and Romanticism is a reaction against the overtly rational Neoclassic art. We've already kind of really talked about the subject matter that is down below, but make sure you hit pause and that you write those down. Additional interests and themes in Romanticism are heroic struggles against the odds, spontaneity and creativity, and also nonconformist ideas. Those are also additional interests that are presented as art in this period. Our first artist that we're going to take a look at is actually a guy that bridges the gap between neoclassic and Romantic era. His name is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang. It looks like Ingres, but that's not how you pronounce it. It's Ang or Angre, depending on who you hear pronounce it. And he lived in Italy for a period of time. He admired Raphael. He is a champion and preserver of classicism, but his works show elements of mannerism and romanticism. So he's kind of hard to pin down in terms of what era you would place him in. I've seen him discussed as a neoclassic artist, and I've also seen him discussed as a romantic artist. I'm placing him in the romantic period. So this is the piece that you have to know. It is called the Le Grande Odalisque. So an odalisque is a woman who lives in a Turkish sultan's harem. So if you look at this, it's exotic, which is to me romantic, the idea of the exotic. These far-flung places that Europeans wouldn't have had access to become subject matter. Now, the mannerist piece of this is that long stretching back of hers and how she curves upwards almost unnaturalistically. So this is just really a play on the reclining nude. So we've seen ideas of reclining nudes in Greece, ancient Greece. We saw them again with Titian in the Venus of Urbino, and we're seeing them again here in the Romantic era. And I'm going to show you a neoclassic example in a few minutes of a reclining, a recumbent or reclining nude, but this is an example to me of a romantic one. This was not a really popular painting when it was exhibited at the salons in Paris, so it was kind of criticized because the back, it's not very realistic in terms of the anatomy. So again, it has that mannerist stretched out technique. And if you think of what's neoclassic about this? Why would they place it in the neoclassic era? One of the reasons is it has kind of these old-time, ancient, pipe apparatuses over here. She's in a pose that essentially goes back to ancient Greece with the Aphrodite. So that's what really would be the neoclassic elements. The Turkish elements, we have an incense burner on the right-hand part, the peacock fan. She has a kind of tapestry-like turban on, hashish pipe as well, and that's where the name Odalisque comes from because of all these Turkish elements. It's, again, heavily influenced by mannerism, by those exaggerated body forms. And it's just another addition to the idea of the female form in terms of nudity. And that up there is actually a painting by Jacques-Louis David done in the neoclassic style of Napoleon's wife, Theodora. So that's her up there. There's actually a nude version of it as well. So, that is an example of a neoclassic, looks very Grecian or very Roman, as if she's almost in a Roman home, which is why it's neoclassic versus another style. So on to our next artist, Eugene Delacroix, and he painted a painting that most of you have already seen before, and he is a leader in the French Romantic movement. He's kind of this aloof aristocrat. He is popular in society and intensely passionate. So what's happening in the painting that we're about to look at is Liberty Leading the People. This is a period after kind of the beginning of the French Revolution and after Napoleon are out of power. We're now in 1830. So what happens is Napoleon overthrows the democratic government of the French Revolution. He rises up for a period of time. He creates this large French empire, and then he tries to go take over Russia. Never a good idea to try to take over Russia. And 500,000 French soldiers will die, and he leaves from power. Now, what happens after he leaves is two French kings will come in. One of them was a brother of Louis XVII, the king who gets decapitated during the beginning of the French Revolution. He is Louis XVIII. He is a relatively reserved king. He is moderate. He is working with the elected government of France at this point as well. But he will die. And another king comes in, Charles X. And he is going to essentially bring back the age of absolutism. And what will happen with this is, in the age of absolutism, the French are going to lose all of the rights that they had prior, or that they had won during the Revolution. So then you have a second French Revolution start in 1830. And what he is doing here is painting kind of the overall idea of patriotism of this 1830 revolution. And Delacroix does not fight, but he says, at least I will paint for my country. And this is the painting that all of you have seen before. If you haven't seen it, it was in the French, or it was in the Freshman Art Gallery. It's a rather large painting. It's an oil on canvas. It sits in the Louvre today. You have the personification of Lady Liberty in the center. She has a Fijian cap on, which represents liberty. She's holding a bayonet, or she's holding a rifle with a bayonet on it, and then the French flag, the tricolor. And what you have in the background is the Cathedral of Notre Dame that actually has the tricolor raised on top. You have various people of all social classes fighting in this revolution to bring back the rights that people had fought for in the original French Revolution. You had children, you had poor, you had rich. There's a person dying at Lady Liberty's feet looking up at her right before they die. That's in the blue. And then you also have a child over to Lady Liberty's left, and that the child was actually a famous child that did live in the French Revolution and will die fighting for the rights of the people in this version, or in this part of the French Revolution. So I'm not going to go through and read all this. We kind of really talked already about what was seen here. Again, we have the hat of liberty on here, on the dying man. We have various people that are dead. We have a dead soldier down below. A lot of the soldiers, they were ordered by the king to fire on the revolutionaries. They basically put their guns down, and they wouldn't fight, and they wouldn't shoot upon the people of the French Revolution that were fighting for their rights. And if you ever see the movie Les Mis, this is, in the play Les Mis, this is the version of the French Revolution, or the part in the French Revolution that play and that movie is based off of. So now shifting gears a little bit. So we've been in France for a while looking at the French art of the Neoclassic and the Romantic era. That is not the only part of the world that had Romantic art. We're going to move to England now and look at really the most famous English artist of the 1800s. His name was Joseph Mallord Turner, and he is an artist that will really come into his own in the early 1800s, and then will be prolific all the way until his death in 1851. He is a big influence on modern art and abstractionism and expressionism, and we'll see that as we get into those styles in the early 1900s. So this is the painting that you have to know. First glance looking at it, you're like, what is going on here? First off, it's all about drama. And again, Romanticism is really all about drama. And this is based off of a true story. It was based off of an event that took place in 1781, where a slave ship, the Zong, sailed for America, and it was full of slaves. Now, the slaves were insured against accidental drowning, but not against sickness. So a policy that was instituted that forced captains to treat slaves humanely. But what happened is a lot of the slaves started getting sick, and the captain knew he wasn't going to get paid if the slaves were sick and they died. So what he actually does, he just starts throwing the slaves overboard, and they're still chained. And we're seeing this drama here of the sun is going down. It is a violent storm kind of creeping in from the left-hand side. It'll be moving across the top of the canvas from the left to the right. You have the violence of the seas here, the power of nature being seen. And so knowing that the captain would not collect the insurance money on sick and dying slaves, the captain just cast them overboard. And you see some recognizable forms. We see the ship over here. We see over here, when I blow the picture up bigger, you can actually see the forms of the slave that is drowning. His hands are chained together, and the ship and the man are reduced in size to really kind of show the vastness and the power of nature kind of consuming this canvas. And we have this bloody sunset that kind of really acts as a symbol of the actual scene that's taking place here, this dramatic scene of these slaves being thrown overboard while still alive. And if we take a look here, we can see the arm of a slave, and we see these birds kind of swooping in, pecking either at a dead body or a body that's about to die, just waiting. And we see the chain on the arm, and then we see some other people over here that have been thrown over. So there's very, very dramatic scene, and it was meant to be a commentary, a negative commentary on slavery, and that the dramatic practices that went along with slavery. So out of Romantic painting also comes landscape painting. We haven't really focused on landscapes really at all. We've looked at still lifes, we looked at genre painting, we've looked at painting of various aspects of the classical era, and we've looked at self-portraits, and we've looked at portraits of people, and now we're going to see how artists are going to take the landscape and adapt it to the canvas. And one of the reasons why artists begin to do landscape paintings is the development of tubed paint. Tubed paint. So paint that was placed in a tube, oil paint, would last much longer, and they could take it and transport it instead of mixing it in their studios. So it allows them to go outside and have these paints ready to go without all the apparatus they would need in their studio to mix the paints together. So, one of the most famous schools of painting in the Romantic era is the Hudson River Valley School that is in New York, in the United States. So, now we're shifting to the U.S. Many artists drew inspiration from the Hudson River Valley, but also painted scenes from across the country. Manifest Destiny was a huge inspiration. So the idea of America going into the West and taming this wilderness is a huge inspiration for these artists. The most famous is Thomas Cole, and his most famous painting is the Oxbow, which hangs in the Met in New York City. So he is one of the founders of the Hudson River Valley School. And what you have here is a very large canvas in person, if you were to see it, but it's divided in half. On the right-hand side, you have the domesticated landscape. You have farmland, you have the land, you have a canal, literally, that is in the shape of an oxbow that is created there. And then on the right side, you have this untamed wilderness, which is essentially the entire western portion of the United States. So on the right, a man's touch is seen in the light, cultivated field, boats drifting down the river, and then it's painted as a reply to a British book that alleged that the Americans had destroyed their wilderness with industry. And what Thomas Cole is saying, look, no, humans have tamed nature, and look how beautiful nature can be once it's tamed by humanity here. And Thomas Cole actually paints himself into the painting. He is right here. He has his umbrella, he has his easel here, and he has all of his paint supplies. So he is ready to paint, and he is out there in the in nature, looking over this beautiful scene in the Hudson River Valley. And again, you can see just a little bit. His supplies here, and then Thomas Cole is actually down here. There you go. You can see him with his top hat on. And on to one of the final artists that we'll talk about before we get into some architecture is Goya. So Goya was originally a Rococo painter in Spain. He is a Spanish painter. He will paint the aristocracy. He will hate painting the aristocracy. He will become disillusioned by the aristocracy. He will think that the Spanish monarchs are completely inept, and he will be very influenced by the French Revolution. He wants to see those ideals come and happen and take root in Spain like they had in France. But what eventually happens is Napoleon comes into Spain, and Napoleon will ruthlessly kill many Spanish rebels. And he will become even further disillusioned by that. And then as his life kind of continues, he's financially successful because he's a mass-produced artist who gets a lot of various commissions. And then towards the end of his life, he begins to go death. He also gets dementia, and then he will paint kind of these very, very gory, almost monster-like paintings in his home, and that they will kind of signify his mental state at the end of his life. Now, what you have to know about him, though, for the art history exam is his Romantic era creations, and they are etchings that we're going to look at. So remember, etchings essentially are metal stamps that will be mass-produced. So again, he's impacted by the Peninsular War, where Napoleon will come in and will take over Spain. And he is very much influenced and wants to show the fighting rebels, the Spaniards who will push back against the French dictatorship. He wants to see democracy come to his country. So this is his painting, and it's called There's Nothing to Be Done from Disasters of War. So it was part of a series, and it was 80 etchings that he created, and the artwork was critical of the French occupation of Spain, and then the various Spanish rulers that will come in after the French occupation is over. What you have here is this very sad painting of a rebel who is about to get shot by the French military. We see the dead people before him. We see further people in the background being tied to these posts and being executed at point blank range by the French soldiers. We see the gun barrels coming in, tied up, these defeated rebels who are fighting for those Enlightenment ideas of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, of democracy. They're fighting for this, and they're being pushed back. And he wants to show empathy to these people and their ideas. And it will inspire later on his great painting, the 3rd of May, which we have a large canvas. They believe that this was in Barcelona, or not Barcelona, in Madrid, and we have the French soldiers who almost look like these robots shooting the Spanish soldier or the Spanish rebel who is being lightened up here by this lantern, and he almost looks like Jesus, and that's what he's meant to do. He's a martyr for a cause that these people truly were willing to die for. All right, so now into some architecture. So our first piece of architecture is that we're going to look at is very much Gothic inspired. And again, remember, the Romantic era is inspired by the Gothic era, the Middle Age era. So Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin create the design for the Palace of Westminster, which is also known as the House of Parliament. So the House of Parliament burns down. There is then a contest that the British government will put out to have designs created for their new Parliament building. So there was 97 people that submitted designs. 91 of them were in the Gothic style. 6 were in the Elizabethan style, which were considered to be English styles. It's an enormous structure, over 1,000 rooms, 100 staircases, 2 miles of corridors, but it's a modern office building that is cloaked, really just the facade, though has medieval clothing, but the inside would have been a modern office building. Barry was a classical architect, which accounts for the regularity of the plan, kind of the very rectangular shape of it. Pugin, though, was a Gothic architect. He added the Gothic architectural touches, the tracery on the outside, and you have this profusion of Gothic ornaments that is greater than would appear even in an original Gothic building, especially the detail around Big Ben and the clock tower. And the reason why they included Big Ben is they wanted to kind of create this sense of a village clock that all of these small little hamlets throughout England would have had, but now this was a clock for all of England. This is one of the interior rooms, meant to be a space where constituents could meet members of Parliament. This grand Gothic hall. We have these metal grills on the doorways and the windows near the House of Commons. Women could be seated to watch Parliament. There were 4 large mosaics over each doorway that we have here of the 4 saints who represent different areas of the United Kingdom. England is St. George, Scotland is St. Andrew, Wales is St. David, and Northern Ireland is St. Patrick. We have here the doorway, an intersectional area of the Parliament building. This is one of the oldest areas, which we've already looked at before. This is where the old Houses of Parliament met. And this goes back to the medieval portion of the building that still survives. And then the final thing we're going to look at is photography is invented during the Romantic era. So what we have here is Louis Daguerre creates something called daguerreotypes. And daguerreotypes are types of photos. They're very early types of photos. He usually created photos that were inspired by still lifes, and they were very much like Vanitas paintings. You had a variety of textures here. You got wicker, you have fabric, plaster. You have a framed print in the background, which has a metal frame and a wooden frame. You also see some textures of metal and so on. And daguerreotypes have a very shiny surface that has a great amount of detail to it. So this is a new invention. And that is it. So we are done the Romantic era, and we have one more video for the 1800s, and that'll be it for this week. See you guys.